Hi, everyone. You're welcome to Threads 2022, our annual cultural conversation. In this session, we'll be discussing education. And it's interesting because it's not just education for education. We're going a bit further and discussing education as it relates to employment. For this panel session, I have three panelists joining me, and I'm going to introduce them quickly. I have Thevi, who is the Associate Vice President International for Saskatchewan Polytechnic. And then I have Shauna Tilbury, who is the Coordinator Learning Support for Saskatoon Public Schools. And finally, I have Dolores Wollbaum, who is an employment specialist. You're all welcome to this session. I would go ahead and ask my first question, and it will go to Shauna. Shauna, do you think employers have learned enough about other cultures so they're able to help immigrants and refugees integrate well into the workplace?
I think this is a huge question, and I was reflecting on it yesterday. I think that it is important to learn about other cultures, but I think part of that comes from learning about your own culture and recognizing your own worldview and being open to the idea that others may bring other worldviews with them. So I have worked with people from diverse cultures my whole career, but do I know enough about every culture? No, I definitely don't. There's so much more learning that I could do. But what I do understand is that my own worldview, my own socialization, my own culture impacts my perspective. And that helps me work easily with others because I can understand that they may bring skills and viewpoints to the workplace that I don't have, and that's helpful to me.
Michael, if I might add to that response and suggest that I think there's much effort being made on the part of employers to ensure that their staff, their administrators have a broader knowledge about intercultural competence. The challenge I see is that it is not spread throughout the organization. So while you might have administrators developing skills to better support new immigrants and refugees, it doesn't filter all the way down. And I think that is something we need to make sure that in conversations with employers that they understand that it's where the rubber hits the road is where we need to make some changes on the front lines.
Yeah, thank you so much. And while we still have you on the screen, I'll probably ask you the next question. And that would be how critical is the entrenchment of a worldview? Because Shauna has already mentioned that in educational curricula at all levels of learning.
I think it's vital. We live in a very complex society. I think youth of today, workers of today recognize that they are interconnected in so many ways. I think when we look at the microchip shortage and how it's impacting the whole world, we recognize that we're globally connected and that as employers and employees, we have to have this common understanding of our unique place in the world. We need to have a shared humanity. We need to recognize that we are all seeking the same good life. And I think that's where sometimes we might have sort of a misunderstanding in terms of newcomers. We see them as seeking to have a new life, but we expect them to start at the bottom, going up. And I think recognizing that they too come with a complex and valuable set of skills is important to ensuring that we grow as a country, as an economy, etc. But the other thing I wanted to touch on is the need to ensure that we incorporate into our education systems a worldview. We incorporate into our learning systems, into our workplace a worldview. We are a globally mobile world, and I think Canada is a reflection of that global mobility. Moving forward, I think in the next 2-3 decades, we'll see a huge amount of global migration The climate crisis is going to exacerbate this mobility. And so for us to better live together in more harmonious societies where we don't structure ourselves as nation states, I think it's important to incorporate from the very beginning of a person's education the notion that we are all global citizens. We live together, we share common humanity. And the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2030 helps set a path for that. And I think every organization needs to look at how can they bring those goals into the workplace, into the institution, and share those goals and embed those goals into curriculum, learning, etc. So that students, workers moving through the system have a basic understanding that, hey, we have these goals that will help support humanity as a whole, and we can make a contribution.
Thank you so much, Thevi. Shauna, you want to quickly say something? Please go ahead.
I wonder about our use of the word worldview. When I think worldview, I think cultural perspective, as in a unique cultural perspective based on your own experiences and cultures. But when I hear Thevi talk about it, it sounds more like a global view of the idea that we're all globally connected. So I just wanted to clarify that before we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is a conversation where, you know, like it's important that we all hear ourselves, and it's important that all perspectives are put out there on the table. So absolutely, thank you so much for that clarification and for jumping in, Shauna. Because Thevi had already mentioned bringing those goals into the workplace, I guess I will jump up to Dolores now. Our employment specialist, and find out from her, do you think noticeable differences in cultural practices facilitate or hinder retention and human flourishing for immigrants and refugees in the workplace, Dolores?
Well, I think there's quite a variety of workplaces and, you know, talking about different worldviews. I think that's something that even newcomers to Canada, particularly international professionals, experience when meeting employers or in the workplace. And so some of that is worldviews in terms of even values. So in Canada, we really emphasize the individual and initiative. And so that comes up again and again, where that is a very key workplace culture, expectation, you know, unspoken. And other people come from a worldview that is very much about a community approach, and not elevating yourself to seem superior to others. And so one of the things that happens a lot is this mismatch, which can hinder people's success in the workplace. And so I've noticed again and again, those of us who do employment coaching, is to explain this difference and how important it is in Canada about taking initiative, about speaking up, rather than waiting for a more senior person to ask your opinion.
Thank you so much, Dolores. And I think I'll come back to you, Shauna, just picking up from where Dolores stopped. And the question would be, do you think newcomers bring with them a unique point of view that might be considered adequate and workplace ready? Again, you know, I like that you've had all this considerable experience working in building and developing learning at all levels. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, if I think about the word worldview in terms of perspective, then definitely newcomers bring a worldview and perspective. is it adequate? I think so. I think employers hopefully value the worldviews and perspectives that newcomers bring and the skills that they bring. And I was thinking about, in terms of Dolores's experience, can someone's perspective on things, values, can they be shifted easily in order to fit into the workplace? And that might be quite a challenge for newcomers, but also the employer. And does the employer understand why a newcomer is, behaving in a certain way or not performing as expected? And is this, hopefully, I hope that employers see that it's their responsibility to determine what's going on and not just make assumptions about performance. So I was thinking also, is it possible to separate the someone's worldview and their skill set? Are skill sets and worldviews tied together? And I think that they probably are. So yes, I think, in many cases, newcomers are workplace ready in a sense, but I think there are some, I don't know, sometimes we refer to them as soft skills that maybe are difficult to teach and that newcomers need to pick up on the fly or in the job. And so hopefully employers are taking that into account when they're working with newcomers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shauna. Let me come back to you, Dolores, again, picking up from where Shauna stopped.
Yes, I'd love to say more.
Yeah, so yeah, and the question would be, do noticeable differences in cultural practices facilitate or hinder retention and human flourishing for immigrants and refugees in the workplace? Because at the end of the day, right, we want this flourishing to happen, both for the newcomer and even for the Canadian workplace and economy and society.
Well, I think there are two key things that can really help with the flourishing aspect, and that's certainly what I have seen in many instances. And so one is the critical need for the education of employers of intercultural awareness, to realize that what is maybe seen as a bad employee here or not a team player or not speaking up is a cultural difference. And so that intercultural awareness of employers, and as Thevi said, at all levels within a company, is really important. The other key thing that has made a difference in people's flourishing is for newcomers, international professionals, to know about these values or unspoken workplace norms. So making them visible. So much in any culture is unspoken norms. So when you make that visible, when you have conversation and education of newcomers about that, it makes a huge difference in their success in the workplace, in being successful from the beginning and really flourishing.
Thank you so much, Dolores.
Michael, I'd like to just add something. And, in my observation with respect to how we welcome new immigrants or newcomers to the workplace, and how we inadvertently exclude by concepts and terminology that might be viewed differently and by the newcomers, and Dolores talked about this. The notion of team. We value team, the notion of team, that this is important. We're all in this together. And we have certain expectations about what constitutes a team player. And when we have individuals who come from cultures where there's a hierarchy in the relationship between employee an employer, and that hierarchy, will extend all the way up in terms of how they respond to directives and engagement. We need to recognize that it takes a while for people to disentangle those notions of hierarchy, and that just jumping in and being part of the team and putting your ideas forth all the time is not something that comes easily. And I've observed this, and I've working in international education. I've often had the good fortune of hiring newcomers to my teams, and I've seen how people need to be brought along in terms of understanding the notion of team. Now, if you don't recognize that, you might perceive them as being not contributing, not bringing enough to the table, etc. I just thought I'd highlight that in terms of my experience in terms of working with newcomers.
Yeah, thank you, Thevi. And I think you should stay on because I think the next question goes to you. And how might cultural ideas, beliefs, and practices influence curricular development and education, and what impact it might have in the workplace?
Tremendous. I mean, using Canada as an example and recognizing historically where our pedagogy and ways of teaching and knowledge acquisition come from, Judeo-Christian, Anglo-Saxon. And so when we go through the education system, get into the workplace and work with people from different cultures, we bring to the workplace, we view the world through that lens in terms of how we've acquired our knowledge. And when confronted with difference, we take a binary approach. That's the Western notion. It's either here or there. We don't tend to see quickly the layered complexity. And that's across the spectrum in terms of arts, science, in terms of how we view the world. I use an example sometimes in terms of engineering. Our Western science puts steel as the must-have for strength and security in a building, in scaffolding, etc. If you go to parts of Asia, you will find that they use bamboo scaffolding. You will not have any foreman or architect endorse the use of bamboo scaffolding here in Canada. And that just indicates to you how we see, engineering. We hold these values to be true, and that this is the way it is. Yes, we acknowledge steel is like a very robust and trustworthy sort of component in building, but there are other societies that have used that technology, another technology, for centuries, and have had success building huge pyramids and temples and things like that. So I draw that example to reflect on how we see based on the learnings we've had, the teachings we've had, how we view the world as us having this knowledge that is grounded, and therefore we don't necessarily, we have a different perspective and not necessarily welcome a perspective from afar if it's not grounded in the same way as we see the world. I do believe that we bring to the workplace a point of view based on our education, and we need to make sure that in our curriculum development, we incorporate perspectives that are unique and different, using that example in engineering in terms of bamboo scaffolding versus the steel scaffolding.
Thank you, Thevi. I've seen bamboo scaffolding where I'm from.
I'd like to speak more on this, if that's okay.
Yeah, but Shauna wanted to say something. Shauna, do you want to?
Sure.
I'm just, the idea of curriculum being culturally influenced. Of course, that's a huge challenge in our K-12 system, because typically the curriculum is being built by people who have like Thevi said, a fairly Anglo-Saxon Judeo-Christian point of view, because that's how they've been socialized in the education system. So I think if we want to get to a place where our curricula in K to 12 are more globalized, we need to include diverse voices at the table as we're building it. And I think that's one of the challenges we face, I think.
That's a very good point, Shauna. That's a very good point. Dolores?
Yes, I think the conversation is getting really exciting now. So we're all wanting to talk at once. I'd like to talk about the regulated professions a bit in terms of how there is differences in construction methods. So there is diversity around the world in terms of bamboo, for example, scaffolding or construction. It was mentioned that we prefer steel. There is, to me, this is more than worldview differences. So all of the regulated professions are highly regulated in Canada. And it can feel like a real barrier to people. But all of those regulated professions, it has to do with public health and safety. So doctors, nurses, engineers, lawyers, accountants. So public health and safety. And so I actually think in what I've seen is it is important to have these actual standards, and that this is different than worldview. So for example, I've met international engineers. They may have done incredible projects in their country, but they've never had to calculate as an engineer what the load bearing capacity is with 30 feet of snow on top of a structure. And so there are things that become really critical that are gaps in knowledge. And so not that we can't make that international recognition of people's education and credentials from work experience smoother. There are real differences. And so with that assessment process, taking the engineer example as well, that assessment then might say this person needs to take an advanced materials course at a university. I also think of situations where, yes, there's cultural differences in terms of medical doctor practices in other parts of the world. But when you have a doctor come to Canada and they've been in a country with a culture where not only is it called a lady doctor, they only have female patients. And similarly, there'll be male doctors who only have male patients. And so there has to be a way that people's education, their training in the medical field is expanded so that we do have this consistent approach to medicine and patient care. So those are two examples that I want to share, that there are pieces that have to do with skills and expertise that really do matter in these regulated professions.
I'm glad you brought that up, Dolores. So if I hear you correctly, it's clear that there are stakeholders, as far as this conversation is concerned. And in our contemplation of this subject about education and how it relates to employer and employees, we have to balance the interest of the various stakeholders and how what impacts their roles might have to the generality of of everyone who might be impacted in what a particular organization is set up to provide, or what an employer, whether it was a newcomer or not, was employed, the service they're employed to provide. So as we contemplate this, I was wondering, perhaps, and we'll close on this, have each of you reflect on this and possibly speak to the various stakeholders, and in maybe 1 or 2 minutes, what do we need to know? What do we need to hear? What do we need to take into consideration when developing the curricula, in Shauna's case, for instance, or when we need to, bring on board newcomers into our organizations? So I think I will start with Shauna.
I think just through this very short conversation, we can see it's a very complex topic and there are many parts to it. And I think, I don't know if it was Thevi or Dolores who mentioned it previously, but it's complex. Curricula are influenced by worldviews, by local conditions, by all sorts of things. And so I think that the ideal is that the newcomer has a little bit of additional information in terms of soft skills and local norms, and the employers also have training on understanding worldview, understanding diverse perspectives, and accommodating and encouraging those perspectives.
Yeah, thank you, Shauna. Dolores, let's hear from you.
Thank you. In answering your part of the question about stakeholders, I would say one of the stakeholders is the general public, in that with the regulated professions, that public health and safety. And so that is important for so many of these professions, and it speaks to the strengths and standards of our educational system. What I think is really fantastic is that at different educational levels, such as, the scale of what Thevi does and what different government sections or departments and regulatory bodies are doing, is they really are pulling that together. So, for example, at one time, to become a nurse, so an international nurse coming to Canada, it used to be quite complex because first there's the credential assessment process, and then there is the licensing process, which could be RN, registered nurse, or which could be LPN, licensed practical nurse. Some incredible work has been done where 18 nursing associations and other groups, because in Canada, each province creates its own regulations for each province. So 18 different stakeholders in the education and assessment came together and actually created one national credentialing system. And it's been fantastic because it's this portal that everybody goes through for the credential assessment, and it's creating that national level of education standardization. And so that's been really great, not only from the stakeholder of Canada, citizens, professions, employers, but also very beneficial from the international nurse perspective.
So finally, to you, Thevi, what might be your perspective? We're discussing perspective, right? And your closing thoughts to the stakeholders we have mentioned.
Yeah, this is a great opportunity to have a conversation about how best to support the integration of newcomers into the Canadian workforce. We need to look at that. With respect to stakeholders and their engagement, I think we recognize that we have a problem in terms of a skill shortage in Canada, or that's what we say we do. In healthcare, in IT, management, administration, we say we have a skill shortage. We also have a disproportionate rate of unemployment and underemployment in certain groups within Canada, among certain groups. And we know that Canada recruits immigrants based on skill level to a large degree. So why are we talking about this huge skills shortage when we have unemployed and unemployed people, and presumably with some skills? What can we do to make the connection so that we are able to support those unemployed and underemployed people to meet those skills shortages? And I think that's a conversation I suspect is happening, but needs to be happening much more widely to have a broader representation of stakeholders to address this.
Thank you so much, Thevi. Thank you, Dolores. Thank you, Shauna. You've all asked very important questions. Sadly, I don't have the answers to those questions. So we'll just leave it to our viewers and our listeners. And we hope that they'll be able to reflect on, this conversation that we have had, and in the places where it matters the most, the changes that we want to see implemented. Thank you so much for being a part of Threads, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.